General Tomoyuki Yamashita formally surrendered, along with his command of 50,000 to the American forces in Camp John Hay, Baguio City. This marked the end of the catastrophic one-month-long Battle of Manila. This battle for the capital city of Philippines was a dark chapter in the ending years of the Pacific Theater, one that devastated a large city, caused more than 100,000 civilian deaths, and led to both a historic war crimes trial and a major Supreme Court decision. After a trial that lasted 5 months, General Yamashita was executed on February 23, 1946. Was the infamous general really guilty of the atrocities committed by the Japanese army? General Yamashita earned the nickname, the Tiger of Malaya, after his army of 30,000 conquered the British-held territory of Malaya, culminating in the fall of the city of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942. Malaya and Singapore had been defended by a combined British and Commonwealth force of 80,000 men. Yet Yamashita's army had beaten the odds and overcome this far larger force, inflicting what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. At the Battle of Jutray in Malaya, the Japanese soldiers were ordered not to take prisoners as it would slow their advance on Singapore. As a result, they indiscriminately captured and killed any Allied soldiers on sight, as well as the civilians, whether they pleaded to surrender or not. The speed and deception earned through the intense fighting style of the Japanese army led to a quick and decisive victory for Yamashita, along with heavy casualties and the occupation of Malaya. The Japanese occupation of Malaya and Singapore was brutal. Following the descent towards the Chinese throughout the wars against China, the worst treatment was meted out to the many thousands of Chinese people who had made Malaya and Singapore their home. In what would become known as the Sukching massacres, thousands of Chinese were rounded up and executed by the Kempeitai, the Japanese army's fearsome military police. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000, mainly Chinese men, met their fate in the purge that followed the invasion of Malaya and Singapore. Despite Yamashita's success in snatching the territory from the hands of the British, the general was banished to the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo in northeast China at the behest of his rival, the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. It wasn't until Tojo and his government fell in July 1944 that Yamashita was able to return to frontline duty, this time as the commander of the defense forces in the Japanese-occupied territory of the Philippines. The fact that he was placed in the Philippines could have only meant one thing. The situation was dire, and all measures had to be done to ensure victory. By September 1944, the tide of the war in the Pacific had turned against the Japanese as the Allies closed in on their conquered territories. The Philippines was one of Japan's last lines of defense. It wasn't as if the country was all that quiet either. By 1944, Communist guerrillas under the Hukbala app had freed a large portion of central Luzon, cutting off Manila from the northern mountains of the Cordillera. Most Filipinos were ready to revolt one way or another. This was the situation Yamashita found himself in command of. He immediately tried to consolidate his forces up north, seeing the mountains as an effective staging ground for a guerrilla strategy. Realizing he could not defend the Philippine capital of Manila against an American invasion force without massive loss of both civilian and military lives, Yamashita ordered a withdrawal of his troops to the Sierra Madre Mountains northeast of the capital. He ordered subordinates to destroy Manila's bridges and port, and then to follow him to the mountains. However, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi of the Imperial Japanese Navy ignored Yamashita's orders, retaking Manila with a force of 16,000 sailors. He was still sore from losing in the Battle of Midway, which saw a large chunk of the Japanese combined fleet sinking at the bottom of the Pacific. Iwabuchi ordered his Marines to fight to the last man. They methodically dynamited Manila's business, government, and religious landmarks, obliterating the city's cultural heritage, and torched thousands of wooden homes, sparking a deadly firestorm. Worse, they cruelly tortured and killed thousands of men, women, and children. The subsequent battle between Iwabuchi's forces and the Americans saw Manila reduced to rubble and resulted in the deaths of an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians. As the American forces closed in, Iwabuchi, who had presided over one of the most barbaric massacres of the war, apparently committed suicide rather than surrender, although his body was never found. Yamashita could do nothing as the Americans and the Japanese fought building by building in Manila, reducing it to rubble. He proceeded with delaying tactics to frustrate any campaign by Filipino guerrillas and American regular forces. The 2 years of fighting hammered Yamashita's forces and whittled them down from 262,000 to less than 50,000 by September. By September 1946, there was no other option to Yamashita. Most Japanese generals embodied a hyper-nationalist code of Bushido and would rather die in battle than surrender to the enemy. Battles like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima were famously terrifying for the sheer loss of life from repeated Japanese suicide attacks. In contrast, Yamashita didn't care for human wave tactics. Though heavily criticized by his peers for being polluted by Western tactics, he also didn't see the need for pointless loss of life. So, in September 1945, Yamashita found himself surrounded on all sides and surrendered. U.S. prosecutors soon charged him with failing to control his troops in the deaths of 62,278 civilians, 144 slain American officers and enlisted men, and 488 raped women and children. Yamashita expressed regret and took responsibility as being in command of troops who acted without his knowledge or consent, even those before he had assumed command. He was not charged with participating in the atrocities or ordering them, or even knowing about them. The U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and allowed hearsay evidence, normally disallowed, to corroborate atrocities thousands of miles from where Yamashita was. The rule of evidence can be boiled down to 2 words: anything goes. General Yamashita was brought forth in front of a commission of U.S. military advocates and charged with crimes violating the laws of warfare. Included in this charge were allegations that forces under his command engaged in a deliberate plan to massacre and exterminate a large part of the civilian population of Batangas province, as a result of which more than 25,000 men, women, and children, all unarmed non-combatant civilians, were brutally mistreated and killed. General Yamashita pled not guilty to all charges. He denied he had knowledge of the crimes committed by his men, and claimed that he would have harshly punished them if he had had that knowledge. He asserted that he did not personally engage in the criminal acts committed by the Japanese troops, that he did not order these acts to be committed, and that he did not have control over the troops under his command. How could I tell if some of my soldiers misbehaved themselves? It was impossible for any man in my position to control every action of his subordinate commanders, let alone the deeds of individual soldiers. The charges are completely new to me. If they had happened, and I had known about them, I would have punished the wrongdoers severely. But in war, someone has to lose. What I am really being charged with is losing the war. He was found guilty by the commission after it heard testimony from 286 witnesses. Upon his conviction, General Yamashita filed a writ challenging the jurisdiction of the military commission, asserted that he did not commit a violation of the law of war, and claimed that he was denied a fair trial under the Geneva Convention and the U.S. Constitution. The United States Supreme Court denied his writ in total. In the Supreme Court's decision, rendered in February 1946, the court articulated a clear standard for military commanders with respect to the actions of their subordinates. In responding to General Yamashita's assertion that he did not personally participate in or order the commission of these offenses, the court described the heart of the charge as being an unlawful breach of duty by General Yamashita as an army commander to control the operations of members of his command by permitting them to commit the extensive and widespread atrocities. The court believed that absent such a duty upon commanders, nothing would prevent occupying forces from committing atrocities upon the civilian population. They held that General Yamashita was, by virtue of his position as commander of the Japanese forces in the Philippines, under an affirmative duty to take such measures as were within his power and appropriate in the circumstances to protect prisoners of war and the civilian population. General Yamashita's was executed by hanging by the United States military. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision set a precedent called command responsibility, or the Yamashita standard, in that a commander can be held accountable before the law for the crimes committed by his troops, even if he did not order them, didn't stand by to allow them, or possibly even know about them, or have the means to stop them. The actions of the Japanese army throughout the Chinese and Pacific theater were some of the worst atrocities committed by mankind. But was a genius general like Yamashita liable to be prosecuted for the actions of his innumerable subordinates? Let us know in the comments below. Stay tuned to find out more about the atrocities committed by the largest armies in history, liberating the past from the cruelty of mankind. This is Time Capsule. Please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss out. Thank you for watching. See you again next time on Time Capsule.